The History of the Court, Part 2. After Franklin Roosevelt's failed attempt to pack the Supreme Court by increasing its size and appointing all the extra judges, the world is faced not only by an ongoing economic depression, but by the greatest war in its history, the Second World War. And during this time, the court changes. By this point, Roosevelt's been around enough so that more Democrat judges are appointed. But also the emergency of fighting the Second World War makes the courts much more friendly to the idea of the federal government becoming involved in the economy or in people's lives, even if that means changing the balance of state and federal power for the sake of victory in the Second World War and for the sake of surviving against the communist threat during the early Cold War. And never let anyone fool you. Those people who say, oh, the red threat, oh, communism, everyone who is anti-communist is just a demagogue like Joe McCarthy. It doesn't know their history. Joe Stalin was the head of the Soviet Union, and he was trying to spread Soviet power wherever he could, by reason or by force, including by subversion here in these United States and the infiltration of of as many of our institutions as possible. So the Supreme Court becomes friendly to federal power increasing for the sake of victory in the war against fascism, National Socialism, and later Communist Socialism. However, the biggest change in the court since the Civil War is going to happen in the 1950s, because President Eisenhower, a Republican, is going to appoint a new Chief Justice who he thinks is moderate. Not moderate. In the mid-1950s, President Eisenhower, the first Republican president in 5 terms, that's 20 years, appoints the governor of California, a moderate Republican named Earl Warren, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, Eisenhower thinks there's a moderate Republican. He's going to be liberal in a few cases, moderate, middle of the road, and conservative in a number of other cases. And he'll also try to, Eisenhower believes, you can't ask a Supreme Court justice candidate these things directly, it's not done, but Eisenhower believes he's going to be fairly conservative. Earl Warren, former governor of California, Republican, appointed by Republican President Dwight David Eisenhower, turns out to be the most activist, liberal leader of the Supreme Court in American history. The Warren Court is famous from the mid-1950s up through the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, that interface, for being absolutely willing to look at every relationship within the federal government, between its branches, between the federal government and the states, and between the federal government and the people, and recalibrate all of these relationships according to a new aesthetic, a new interpretation of the law that is much more friendly to government involvement and government intervention, much less friendly to tradition and to government's role to protect society from its people, much more interested in making sure that absolutely nobody's rights are violated, no matter what the circumstances are. And depending upon your political point of view, you're going to view Earl Warren as a real hero or as a real villain. If you know anything about him, he's one of the most important people in American history most people have never heard of. Earl Warren and the Warren Court, roughly from the mid-50s to around 1970 or so, give or take. That activist court is then followed by the Burger Court in the in the 70s and 80s, and the Rehnquist Court in the 90s and early 2000s. The Burger Court continues a lot of Warren's sort of interventionist, judicially activist policies, Not necessarily quite as activist as Warren had been, but the Burger Court tends to favor a progressive, liberal, judicially active reinterpretation of constitutional values to build a new and better society in the public interest, if you believe in that sort of thing. Rehnquist is more conservative. Rehnquist's court is more conservative than Burger's court. By this point, you have more appointees from Richard Nixon, some of whom turn out to be as liberal as Earl Warren, but some who turn out to be conservative, including Rehnquist. And then you had President Ford, you have President Reagan, 2 terms, you have President George Herbert Walker Bush, 1 term. So the Rehnquist court has a better balance between conservatives and liberals than either the Burger court or the Warren court, which tended to favor the liberals. And during the Burger and Rehnquist period, you have the increasing use of the Supreme Court for political action and judicial activism. The Warren court sort of did it on its own, but by the 1970s, people within the 2 political parties were seeing the Supreme Court as becoming much more political than it ever had been. And more frequently, the Supreme Court is going to be used, or is going to attempt to be used, as a battering ram to bust through social change against popular resistance, as if the job of a court in a free society is to override the will of the people for the sake of what some wise intellectual types think is in everyone's best interests. So, more and more, from the mid-'80s, certainly, you have an increasing acrimony about who's going to be appointed to the Supreme Court. In 86, 87, you had a very well-known, very well-respected conservative jurist named Robert Bork, who was appointed by President Reagan. And the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, including Teddy Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, younger brother, made such a hue and cry. They basically did everything they could to destroy Bork's reputation, not on the basis of his incompetence as a jurist. He, again, was one of the most respected and accomplished jurists in the country in 1987, but on the basis of his conservatism, that he would overturn a lot of the judicially activist decisions of the Warren Court and the Burger Court, particularly the abortion decision in 1973, Roe versus Wade. And in the name of defending that decision, the Supreme Court is going to become much more of a political football, especially to the Democratic Party. And I say that because of the intense firefights over Robert Bork, which ended up defeating Bork, and you ultimately get Justice Anthony Kennedy, and fights over David Souter, who turns out to be a liberal, but he was appointed by Bush, so everyone was afraid, ooh, conservative. The appointment of Clarence Thomas, the court's second African-American after Thurgood Marshall, who was accused of sexual misconduct, much as Judge Kavanaugh was when he was going through it. And Thomas referred to what he went through as a high-tech lynching. And if you know anything about the history of the American South, you know that the term lynching is not to be taken lightly. Even after that, though, the Republican Party did not make a firestorm over the appointments of Justice Breyer or Ginsburg during the time of President Clinton, despite the fact that both of them are extremely progressive, liberal, left-wing, judicially active. The Republican idea up through the early 2000s was that the courts should be as apolitical as possible. If a Democrat president wins election and a Democrat Senate wins election, you're going to probably have Democrat and liberal appointees to the judiciary. That's part of the system, Republicans said. But Democrats, since 86, since 87, since Bork, have fought tooth and nail against anyone that they consider to be less than liberal because they are afraid of losing the decision Roe v. Wade, because the decision about abortion was not made by the legislature, was not made through laws in states or laws in the U.S. Congress, was not signed into law by the president, did not go through the normal political system. And because it didn't, there is a fragility and a brittleness to the whole abortion system in this country, because what the courts can give, the courts can take away. And they know it. Everyone knows it. Which is why the Supreme Court today has become, it should be one of the least political parts of the American government, but it is seen by people more and more on both sides now. After 25 years of being on the receiving end of politicizing Supreme Court justices, Republicans are becoming more politically active about it. But now we have a Supreme Court system where wherever anyone retires or dies in office, there's going to be a firestorm probably about who's going to replace them. So that's where we get to now. The last set of scandals was in Obama's last year in his second term. A retirement opened up, and Obama, in his last few months in office, wanted to appoint Merrick Garland, a moderate to liberal center-right sort of figure. The Republican Senate said, no, we have an election coming up in just a few months, and in that election, the new president will be chosen. If it's Hillary Clinton, it's going to be a liberal Democrat. If it's a conservative president, if it's Trump, it's going to be a more conservative justice. The left went, even though the last time this thing was sort of pulled, a sort of last minute, last few months of office appointment was Abe Fortas by Lyndon Johnson in the late 60s, and that he turned out to be a very temporary Supreme Court justice because he was seen as a political hack by a lot of people. When President Trump was elected, Neil Gorsuch was appointed to the court. The U.S. Senate, Republican-dominated, approved it. Gorsuch is much more conservative than Garland would have been, and this has tilted the court somewhat rightward. And Brett Kavanaugh was appointed also, and he, like Thomas, was dragged through the mud with accusations from decades ago that cannot be proven. Accusations which, by the way, were in both Thomas's case and Kavanaugh's case. Had to look it up. Significantly less documented than the sexual harassment charges being made now by Tara Reade against Vice President Joseph Biden. But the two Supreme Court nominees were conservative Republicans, and so the media had a firestorm over it. But today, everyone seems to be saying, well, we don't think Biden's guilty, so we don't think there's any reason to investigate more deeply. Yeah, I'm a conservative Republican, and I'm telling you that. You can say it's because I'm a conservative and I just don't like Joe Biden. Or you can say it's because, hopefully, I would spot a double standard on the right, just as I spotted one on the left. For example, if a Supreme Court justice were to retire now, we are so close to an election, intellectual honesty would make me say President Trump should not choose. It should be whoever wins the election in 2020. Hopefully, we can on both sides be intellectually honest. In any event, Kavanaugh and Thomas were put through a public firestorm, a purgation, an ordeal. And so far, people are throwing themselves in front of any investigation to protect Joseph or Joe Biden. Yeah, that's a little political. Look it up. Come to your own conclusions. For the rest of this time, we're going to be going over Supreme Court decisions that are key.